Session, we talked about one side of the fence as far as the existence of God or some sort of divine source that's maybe in control of everything, may have some sort of hand in what goes on in the world. And we looked at some arguments that have been developed over the years that people say indicate that it might be rational to believe there is a God, that there is something divine out there that is the source of all things, that's in control of all things. But as you well know, there's another side of that fence, and there's a side of the fence that says it's not rational to think that there's a God, that there's something or someone else out there in control of things. And so we're going to look at that side of the fence today in this session, and particularly we're going to look at that from the perspective of one of the primary arguments that people give for saying it's not rational to think that there's a God, or it's not rational to think that there's something else out there. Sometimes this is called the problem of suffering. Sometimes it's called the problem of evil. Sometimes it's called the Theodicy Problem. And so we're going to talk about this issue that is really probably the #1 issue. If you ask most people who believe there's not a God why they do not think there's a God, this is probably the #1 reason that people give. This problem of suffering, problem of evil, the Theodicy problem. We'll have some links here that you can go to some songs on YouTube that if you want to listen to the entire song, and some of them even have the lyrics. But there's a lot of music out there that presents this argument. The band 9 Inch Nails have several songs that allude to this idea. Probably the two most notable would be A Terrible Lie and Heresy. A few lines from Heresy. He sewed his eyes shut because he's afraid to see. He's got the answers to ease my curiosity. He dreamed up a God and he called it Christianity. Your God is dead and no one cares. If there's a hell, I'll see you there. His perfect kingdom of killing, suffering, and pain demands devotion and atrocities done in his name. Your God is dead and no one cares. Drowning in his own hypocrisy. And if there's a hell, I'll see you there, burning with your God in humility. A kingdom of suffering and pain and killing and atrocities. How can you say there's a God behind that? And then the final line of the song is, will you die for this? You know, he's saying it just doesn't make much sense to say there's a God when an all-powerful, supposedly all-powerful God allows all these atrocities, in his name even at times, to happen. It's hard to justify that there's a God. The band Metallica have some songs also that hit along that line. One of those is a song called The God That Failed. And as I recall, I believe it's about somebody losing their son, and kind of lays that as a parallel alongside God supposedly losing his son. But one of the lines of the song says, I see faith in your eyes, never you hear the discouraging lies. And that's basically the thrust of the song, is that there's somebody that they're hanging on to their faith to the end, and yet there's all these other facts around them in life that would seem to indicate there's not a God, or at least there's not a God that cares. Or if there is a God, he's a God that failed this person. And yet they continue to hear and hang on to what the author of the song calls discouraging lies. The song also says, I see faith in your eyes, never you hear the discouraging lies. I hear faith in your cries, broken is the promise, betrayal. The healing hand is held back by the deepened nail. Follow the God that failed. Trust you gave, a child to save. So it seems like he's saying to a friend that you trusted God to save this child, but he's left you, actually what he goes on and says is he's left you cold and him, the child, in the grave. I see faith in your eyes, broken is the promise, betrayal, the healing hand held back by the deepened nail. You follow the God that failed. So again, even if there is a God, it's a God that seemed to fail him. One other song that you can click to on YouTube, and this does have lyrics for you, is one that was written by the band XTC, and you can find it's performed by them on this YouTube video, but you can also find it by Sarah McLachlan, among others who have recorded it. But again, in this song, he lays out all these things that have happened in the world. Disease, the devil, and supposedly the devil's role in things, religious people fighting over religious teachings and religious books, people starving on the street because they can't get enough to eat. There's lines in here about babes lost at sea and never found, people who drown. I mean, there's all these issues that go on, and the person is saying, you know, even if there is a God, even if you do exist, if you allow this kind of stuff to happen, I don't want to believe in you. I don't want to believe in that kind of a God. Well, what all these indicate is something that in the field of religious studies, in the field of philosophy, is something that's called the Theodicy Problem. And the Theodicy Problem, it doesn't matter what field you run across it in, you find it's outlined as the same thing. And the Theodicy Problem consists of 3 statements. And those statements are, number 1, God is omnibenevolent, or God is all good. God is all loving. God is benevolent. The second statement is that God is omnipotent. God is all powerful. God can do whatever he wants to do. And the third statement is that suffering exists, or evil exists. So first of all, the Theodicy Problem starts out with these 3 statements. God's all good and loving. God's all powerful. And there's suffering in the world. What the Theodicy Problem says, which is really what these songs that I've just referred to say, is how can you rationally put all 3 of those statements together and call them all true? I mean, if there is a God who is everything about God is good, is loving, is compassionate, is benevolent, and if he is powerful enough to do whatever he wants to do in any situation, then why do some of the things happen that happen, especially to innocent children, to innocent people? Wouldn't a benevolent, compassionate, all good, everything about this God being good, wouldn't that God intervene in those situations? I mean, even on a human level, if there's someone that deeply loves someone and they have the power to intervene and keep that person from terrible suffering, wouldn't they? Wouldn't we expect that of them? Might we even call them neglectful or criminal if they didn't intervene when they could for people that they care about? And so the Theodicy Problem says, how can you say that there's an all-good, all-loving, all-powerful God and that suffering exists in the presence of that good, loving, powerful God? So the Theodicy Problem says, you know, it's easy to put 2 of those statements together and come to a rational conclusion. I mean, if God is all good, all loving, all benevolent, and suffering exists, but he's not all powerful, then that explains suffering in the world. God cares about people. God's loving. God's kind. Everything about him is benevolent. But he doesn't have control over everything. He's not omnipotent. He's not all-powerful. And so there are bad things that happen that you can't blame on him because he didn't have power over that. That would be easy to come to rationally, and actually there's a lot of religious people that come to that conclusion when faced with this problem. Some of you might be familiar with a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It was written by a man named Harold Kushner, who is a Jewish rabbi. And the book was written in response to a situation that he and his family had dealt with. He and his wife had a son who was born with a disease that was chronic, that was just debilitating from birth, called progeria. And this book was written about that experience, especially about that experience through the eyes of an experience of a man and his family who were believers in God. He's a Jewish rabbi, continues to be. And that conclusion that I just mentioned is one of the conclusions that he reached in that experience. That he believes that God is all good and all loving and all benevolent and all compassionate and all kind. And that being the case, he cannot believe that God has power over everything, or he would have intervened in such a terrible situation. If not for his and his wife's sake, then for the sake of his innocent child. And so for this rabbi, the rational conclusion is there is a God, and he is all good and loving, but he doesn't have control over everything. He's not all powerful, and that's why these terrible things can happen. Obviously, that's not very satisfactory for most believers, because most believers would say God is all good and all powerful. Another approach on the theodicy problem is to say, okay, so let's say God is all powerful. He truly is. And bad stuff happens in the world. We can't deny that. So maybe God's not all good. Maybe everything about God is not love, compassion, goodness, mercy, and benevolence. Maybe sometimes he just gets downright mad and ticked. Maybe hatred's part of who God is. Maybe a wrathful anger is a part of who God is. And so in that, bad stuff happens in his power and control. Certainly you can read through at least portions of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and see that that might be a possibility. God appears pretty wrathful and angry and vengeful, and benevolence and compassion and kindness don't show up in some of those stories. Certainly that's not the case throughout the whole Hebrew Bible, but there's some stories that would indicate, well, maybe God is all-powerful, but not necessarily omnibenevolent. And then that can explain why suffering exists. But the theodicy problem says where you begin to have problems with rationality, with logic, is when you want to put all three of those statements together as true. That there is an omnibenevolent God, that there is an omnipotent God, and that suffering exists. How do you make sense out of that? I know in my live classes, we often spend most of a class period talking about that, throwing that out there to students. Does that make sense to you? Does it not make sense to you? Often we listen to that song, Dear God, by XTC, or recorded by Sarah McLachlan. And they talk about how they respond to the things raised in that song. How do you make sense, or can you make sense? And of course, some students say, it doesn't make sense to me to say that there's an all-powerful, all-good God and that suffering exists. And so I'm not sure I believe there's a God. And there are others who, they want to try to make sense out of that, and they argue for that. That's the idea of the theodicy problem. Is it rational to say there's an all-good, all-loving God who's all-powerful in the face of the reality that there's suffering in the world? The theodicy problem says it's hard to make sense out of those three statements together. Well, before we look at some responses to the theodicy problem, I want to step out of that a little bit and talk, first of all, for a few minutes about worldviews of evil or worldviews of suffering. Because there might be conversations about suffering in the world that would take a different angle on that suffering than the conversations that we probably would tend to have here in the U.S. from a more Western philosophical mindset. So I want to just familiarize you with three different ways, three different worldviews of how people might approach this issue of suffering and what it is and where it comes from. The first worldview is a worldview that's called monism. And you tend to find a monistic worldview in more Eastern philosophies. Probably Buddhism, of the religions, of the worldviews that we'll look at in this class, probably Buddhism is the most clearly monistic in its approach to this idea of suffering. And what a monistic worldview broadly says is that all of reality, in its truest sense, is unified. All of reality is one thing. It's one entity. Maybe you've heard from a Buddhist worldview, people talk about that the goal is to become one with everything. Well, that's a monistic worldview, to say that what's the truest reality is a reality that we are all one thing. We're all part of one thing. That you and I are one. That all of nature is one with us. And so we care for ourselves and nature and other people as ourselves because we are one. You can't divide that up. So a monistic worldview would say you can't go around dividing up reality. You can't say there's spiritual things and there's material things. A monistic worldview says there's things. Things are reality. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about, angels or heaven or paradise or the soul or pizza or your mom or your dog or anything else that we would tend to call material. It's all just reality. And to say that some things are more spiritual than others or some things are more material than others doesn't work in a monistic mindset. Reality just is. In the same token, when it comes to suffering or when it comes to evil, a monistic worldview says people, circumstances, events, situations, they just are. They're reality. And if we choose to call some of those people or situations good or evil, that's a perception that we place on that. But that's not reality. Reality is what is. And then there's our perceptions of reality that we think is reality, but a monistic worldview says it's not. That's our perception. Things just are. People just are. Situations just are. And to call them good or bad, actually from the religious worldviews that are monistic in nature, to want to place perceptions like good and evil or even spiritual and material on things is a sign of spiritual ignorance, a sign of needing spiritual enlightenment. Because in enlightenment, we would understand things are, period. Not things are good, things are evil, things just are. The example that I give sometimes of this way that we put perceptions on things and call them good or evil is an example that probably for those of you who are around my age or older, you are aware of this example. And for those of you much younger than me, which is more of you all the time, you may not be familiar with this. But when I was growing up, there was a television show on Saturday nights that our family watched. And it was a television show called Hee Haw. And if you're not familiar with the show, it's just like the name sounds. It was a hillbilly show, and they did all these skits and songs, and it was Hee Haw. But there was this one skit that often was in the show that I'm pretty confident that the writers of the show were not thinking, let's do this skit to illustrate a monistic worldview. But it really does illustrate this worldview. And it was a skit that always happened in a barber shop, and the barber was always the same guy, and he'd always have a customer come in and sit in his barber chair, and they would have a conversation. And the conversation would always go like this. Now, the content would change every time. The basic story would change every time. But the flow of it would always go the same way. And it would be something like this. The guy would come in, and he'd sit in the barber chair, and the guy would take his razor, and he'd put his hand on the customer's shoulder, and he'd say, well, Buck, what'd you do today? Buck would say, well, I came to town. And the barber would say, well, that's good. And Buck would say, no, that's bad, because I hit the neighbor's dog on the way to town. And the barber would go, oh, well, that's bad. No, that's good, because nobody liked the neighbor's dog. Oh, well, that's good. No, that's bad, because then the neighbor took off after me with a shotgun. Oh, well, that's bad. No, that's good, because he's a bad shot. Oh, well, that's good. No, that's bad, because he shot my dog sitting next to me in my truck on my way to town. Oh, and it would go like that, where the guy in the chair would say a statement, and the barber would say, that's good, this statement. And then the customer would say, no, that's bad, same statement. And he'd make another statement, that's bad, no, that's good. Same statement, the same, Buck went to town, that's reality. Was that a good or bad thing? Well, it depends on your perception of Buck coming to town. Buck ran over the neighbor's dog. Was that a good or bad thing? Well, it depends on your perception of it. The reality is he ran over the neighbor's dog. So a monistic worldview says that suffering, evil, good, in and of themselves do not exist. They are simply perceptions that we put on circumstances, or people. So from a monistic worldview, reality is suffering doesn't exist, period. Reality exists. And if we call something in reality suffering or evil or good, that's our perception of it, but it's not that. And so good things don't happen from a monistic worldview. Bad things don't happen. Things just happen, period. These next two will be a little more familiar. Dualistic worldview. You tend to find a dualistic worldview in like a lot of your Greek philosophers. Socrates is known as a famous dualist in a lot of the writing that he did. You tend to find a dualistic worldview with a lot of your cartoon superheroes. That their approach to good and evil in the world is often from a dualistic mindset. And what a dualistic mindset says is that there is good and evil. They are realities. And it's along the lines that good and evil are these kind of cosmic forces. And they are always in war with one another. It's like there's this cosmic tug of war always going on between good and evil, both equally strong. And so maybe kind of the mental idea is that you got good and evil in this tug of war. And the bandana that's tied in the middle of the rope, most of the time, day in and day out, just kind of stays right there around the middle. But every once in a while, the forces of evil win out over the forces of good. And so the result of that is something bad happens because the forces of evil won out over the forces of good. Sometimes the forces of good win out over the forces of evil. And so there are good things that happen as a result of that. Don't you see that all the time in your cartoon superheroes, where the good heroes are joining the forces of good and the evil ones are joining the forces of evil, and usually whatever happens in the battle affects a whole lot of other people, whether good or evil wins. That's the idea of the dualistic worldview. So from a dualistic worldview, when good or bad things happen in our lives, it's as a result of fate. Now, some of you may use that word sometimes, but the idea of fate from a dualistic worldview is that forces beyond our control caused this to happen. There wasn't anything that we really did to make this happen. The forces of good or the forces of evil won out. And so something good or something bad happened. So in a dualistic worldview, there is good and evil, but we don't have a whole lot of control over that happening. There's other forces beyond our control that bring that good or evil into our lives. The third worldview, which when we have conversations in our classrooms, is probably the predominant worldview. It's either and it's on both sides of the fence. Those who are arguing for the existence of a God are often arguing out of this worldview, and those who are arguing against the existence of God are often arguing out of this worldview. And that's understandable because it's the worldview that you find within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And obviously, at least here in the Western philosophy, Judeo-Christian ideas, even regardless of how secular we become, still underlie a lot of the ways that we think about things, a lot of the ways we think about reality. And so the monotheistic worldview is that third worldview. And the monotheistic worldview says there's one, mono, God, theism. You find this worldview, as I said, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam primarily. And this is a worldview that says there is a God. And when God created the world and humanity, He created it perfect. But His perfection got flawed because of human choice, because humans chose evil. And so as a result of that, the potential for evil is now within humans. It's now within sort of the system of how things work. And so bad things happen as a result of human choice. I mean, even from this worldview, natural disasters are often placed on the shoulders of humanity. Because the idea that's often carried out from this monotheistic worldview from even back in the 4th century or so is the idea that God created everything in perfect harmony and balance. And when humans chose things outside the will of God, then that harmony and balance was upset. And so it's kind of like the natural order got sort of tilted. And the more that humans choose outside the perfect, harmonious will of God, the more it upsets this balance and harmony of the universe. And so things happen like winds blowing in ways they weren't created to blow. Waters moving in ways they weren't created to move. The earth shaking in ways it wasn't created to shake if it were working in perfect balance and harmony. But because of human choice, the whole natural order is out of balance. So monotheistic worldview says, yes, there is suffering in the world, but by and large, it's placed on the shoulders of humanity. Because a monotheistic worldview comes back to that theodicy problem and says, if there's a good God who's all-powerful and suffering exists, then it can't be God's fault that bad stuff happens. That wouldn't make sense. That it's hard to rationalize that with that theodicy problem, as we said earlier. And so responsibility is placed on the shoulders of humanity, and that we are the source of our problems. The song that you might have gone and watched and listened to, Dear God, when we talk about that song in class, those students in my classes who argue for the existence of God in the face of suffering look at that song and basically say, all the stuff that's listed in that song, we have caused. We have brought it on ourselves. You can't blame God. And that's the basic thrust of the monotheistic worldview. So from these different worldviews, you have one, the monistic worldview, that says, well, suffering in and of itself doesn't even exist. Evil in and of itself doesn't exist, only in your perception of something. You have a dualistic worldview that says, yeah, good and evil exist, but when good or evil things happen, it's because of something outside of our own control. We don't have any influence over that. It's fate. And then you have the monotheistic worldview that says, yes, good and evil exist, but evil exists because of human choice, not because of God. And those tend to be the three primary worldviews of the idea of suffering or evil. Now, when we talk about suffering or we talk about evil, typically in these kinds of discussions, again, whether it's in religious studies or philosophy or theology or whatever, what you see is a list of 4 different kinds of suffering or 4 different kinds of evil. And so I want to cover those here real quickly. The first of those is moral suffering or moral evil. These are the kinds of things that we as humans do that bring suffering to ourselves or to others. Killing, stealing, lying, suicide, betrayal, adultery. Those are moral evils, choices that we make that the result is that somebody gets hurt. Somebody suffers. It brings evil into somebody's life. That's moral suffering or moral evil. The second kind is physical evils or physical suffering. And these are things related to our physical bodies. Disease, disability, things that where our just aging and the pain, the physical pain that goes with aging, things where our bodies aren't working the way we want them to work or the way that we think they ought to work. And those things that bring suffering as a result of that. The third kind is natural evils or natural suffering, and these would be primarily natural disasters. Tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes. These kinds of natural events or natural disasters, as we sometimes call them, that happen, that bring suffering into people's lives. The fourth kind of suffering or evil is what's often called finitude. And when you look at that word, you see that the root of that word is the word finite. And of course, finite means that something has an end, that it doesn't go on, that it has an end to it. And that's the idea of finitude, that nothing lasts. Everything has an end. If you're familiar with the old Kansas song, Dust in the Wind, that whole song's about finitude. Nothing lasts forever. Everything's dust in the wind. So don't hang on because everything's dust in the wind. Nothing lasts. And the reality, when we hit the realities of finitude in our life, it's painful. That brings suffering. The reality that everything right now that you hold on to so dearly, over the course of your life, you will probably not have. It's going to end at some point along the way. Now, obviously, the most obvious expression of finitude would be death. That none of us are going to last forever. We all have an end. And none of the people in our lives are going to last forever. They all have an end. And we all know that when we deal with death in our lives, that brings suffering, that brings pain. But it can be about much more than just death. I remember the first time I kind of got my own personal picture, I guess, of finitude beyond just death. One of my grandmothers was dying of cancer, and she was in hospice. And so in the last weeks of her life, family were staying with her and stuff pretty much 24/7. And so there was a weekend near the end of her life that I was home, out of state is where my family lives. And so I stayed with her through most of the night, this one night. And it was one of those nights where every breath, you weren't sure if the next one was going to come. And so I was very focused on her all night long and just watching her and thinking about her and thinking about her life. And as I got thinking about her life, at this point, she was around 90 years old. At this point, her husband had died years previously, and they had been married more than 60 years. She was raised on a farm. She and my grandfather farmed. As a matter of fact, my grandfather died scooping corn in a grain bin. I mean, he farmed right to the end of his life. But then after he died, sold the farm, moved to town. So her way of life that she had always known, that was more rural, ended. She had several siblings. The last of her siblings had died about 6 months earlier, an older sister. And so she was the only one left of her siblings. She had a grandchild who had preceded her in death. I mean, I just started thinking about when she was my age, what her life probably looked like. And now, at 90 years old, that none of that stuff was in her life anymore. Or most of that stuff was not. Finitude was a reality. And of course it got me thinking about, okay, so all the stuff that I hang on to so dearly right now in my life, it's the same path. Things change and things come to an end. And that's the idea of finitude, that it brings pain into our lives. Well, in my live classes at this point, I talk to them about how when we start looking at how religions, how people respond to this problem of suffering or this theodicy problem, you kind of find two avenues of response, two responses to suffering in our lives, and even within the religions that we are going to look at. And one of those is that there tends to be some responses that might be called more like treating suffering or evil as a problem. And then another avenue is treating it as a mystery. And to illustrate that a little bit to the students, we have a discussion where I say, look at that list of kinds of suffering or kinds of evil: moral, physical, natural, finitude. And think about a time in your life when you experienced one of those. And most people have by this point. And then I have them talk about when you were, or as maybe you are, experiencing that type of suffering in your life, what are the things that people said or did in an effort to help or support that honestly weren't that helpful? Might even be things that we say or do for other people, but the truth is they're not that helpful. And so they start talking about things. Well, when people say it was God's will, because again, that brings up this whole thing, how could a good loving God have this to be within his will? Or when people say there's a purpose in this. Well, when you're going through that, it's hard to find a purpose in it. Or when people say, this is teaching you something, it's going to make you a better person. And again, a lot of times our response is, I don't know if the lesson learned is worth its loss. when people say time will heal. You know, that there's all these things that we say or that we write on greeting cards that they may be true. But when we're going through a situation, they aren't that helpful. And then I ask students, okay, so when you were going through this time of suffering, or maybe as you are going through it, think about who has been most helpful. What has that person done or said that you would consider most helpful? And the vast majority of the time, they say that those most helpful said nothing. We're just there with them. Hung out with them and just did stuff with them along the way. Just let them cry and talk about it. They were just present with them. And then I always tell students, you've just illustrated perfectly these two different avenues of response to suffering. Because there's the avenue that treats it like a problem. Now, if we treat something like a problem, well, what do we assume? There's an answer, there's an explanation, there's a reason, there's a purpose. And so all these answers that we give one another that may or may not be true, but don't seem that helpful when we're going through stuff, those are all kind of treating suffering like a problem. There's an answer, and I feel compelled to give you an answer. There's an explanation, and I feel compelled to give you an explanation. I feel compelled to try to make sense out of this for you. That's treating it as a problem. When you look at ways traditionally or ways philosophically that people answer to suffering as a problem, a few of the common responses are that it is a test of faith. This is a test to see how strong you are. So hang in there and pass the test. Well, most of us, when we're in the middle of that situation, passing the test is the last thing we're interested in doing. We just want to survive. We just want to get through. And then there's the question of, well, who's testing? And if it's God, and if God's all-knowing, then doesn't He already know what my faith is like? Why does He have to put me through this test? And so there's a lot of questions with that. Another response that sometimes people give in responding to suffering as a problem is that it's a teacher. This will teach you some valuable things. So learn what you can learn from this. When the book that I referred to earlier, When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Kushner, he specifically addressed that response in his book. And he said, you know, he told himself that sometimes. And others told him that this is a powerful learning experience for you and your family. And he actually writes this beautiful portion of the book where he talks about the things that he and his family did learn through this debilitating chronic disease that his son had to endure. And there was a lot that he learned. But at the end of all that, he says, but you know what? If I had a choice between the suffering, between the lessons I learned and not learning those lessons, if it would mean that my son did not have to suffer like he suffered, I'd rather not learn the lessons. It doesn't balance out in the formula for some people. There are those who are quick to say that sometimes bad things happen as a punishment for sin. When 9/11 happened, there were some who said that happened to the U.S. because of sinful things in the U.S. When hurricanes or tsunamis have hit certain parts of the world, the U.S. and beyond, there are those who've been quick to rise and say, well, that's because of God's wrath on some of those people in that area and the kinds of lives they live, or that they don't believe in God, or that they, whatever the reason, it's a punishment. There are some diseases that people get that people just chalk up to it's God's punishment for sin. There are some things that happen in people's lives that from a distance we can look at that and it might be easy to say it's punishment for sin. They shouldn't have been driving drunk. But if it's your son and he was driving drunk and he's laying there now and he's a quadriplegic, is that a good answer for you, a satisfactory answer that it's punishment for a sin that he committed? it almost feels like that's too simplistic. There has to be something much larger here, and maybe more mysterious. In responding to suffering as a mystery is something that we know there probably is an answer, but when we call it a mystery, we're saying, but we don't know what the answer is. We don't think the answer is able to be located, it's able to be found. And so those people that when we're going through bad times, that they just sit with us. They let us cry or holler or punch. They just take us out and let us do something to kind of put our energy into something else. They don't feel compelled to give us answers or make sense out of it. They are entering into the mystery of suffering. Even though they may not say it, they're saying, I don't know the answer. I don't know if there is an answer. But I'll walk with you through this. That's responding to it as a mystery. You know, when you look at the major world religions and their responses to suffering, you can find both of those. In every religion, you can find ways that you could say that that religion is treating suffering as a problem. It gives answers, it gives explanations, it gives reasons for why bad things happen. And you can also find in every major religion ways that it would seem that that religion isn't hung up on giving answers, reasons, and solutions, but treats suffering much more like a mystery that we enter into as part of being human. Now, we can't cover all those within all the religions in the scope of this class, but let me just talk about a few of the kind of traditional responses to suffering that you find within major religions. First of all, within Hinduism. Some of you probably know this. From a Hindu perspective, when something happens to you, good or bad, what's the explanation? Karma, right? Karma, the belief that, as some say, what comes around goes around, or what goes around comes around. Or as some say, karma is the belief that whatever you do comes back to you. Karma is the belief that you never escape the consequences of your actions. And from a Hindu worldview and from a lot of Eastern worldviews, it's a law. It's karmic law. It's like the law of gravity. That you do not do anything that does not come back to you in some way, good or bad. So if something bad happens to me, from a karmic worldview, which again is the predominant worldview you would find in Hinduism, the answer is you brought it on yourself. You've done something, if not in this life, in a previous life, that has brought this suffering on yourself. Hinduism really kind of has an answer, treats it like a problem to some extent in its traditional response. In Buddhism, there's a story that's kind of the traditional story to explain suffering, or to explain why we think they're suffering, of a woman named Kissa Gotami. And Kissa Gotami was a disciple of the Buddha. And the story goes that Kissa Gotami had a son that died. And so she came to the Buddha carrying the body of her dead son, crying, mourning. You know, her son's dead. And she's asking the Buddha to tell her why this happened. And the Buddha says, I can give you medicine for your son. I can give you medicine for your suffering. And she says, okay, I want the medicine. And he says, what I want you to do is go to every house in the village and ask if that house has experienced the death of anyone in their family. And when you find houses that have not experienced death, ask them to give you some mustard seed. And then come back to me with your mustard seed, and then we can make the medicine that you need. So Kissa Gotami goes off, carrying the body of her dead son, going house to house, asking if each household's experienced death or not. Well, as the story comes around, when she comes back to the Buddha, she's not carrying the body of her dead son. She's changed her clothes. She's not mourning anymore. And she comes back to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, I see that you have already found your medicine. And she says, yes, because I realize that every household has experienced death. And that it's just a part of life. It's a part of being human. And I choose whether to call that suffering or not. Remember, it's the monistic worldview that says death is. Whether it's good or evil is our perception of it. And through that experience, Kissa Gotami's perception of the death of her son changed. and she didn't feel compelled to call it suffering. The monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, share a story that's often a traditional story to explain suffering and to respond to suffering. And it's a story of a man named Job. It's one of the oldest stories from the monotheistic tradition. And the basic story is that Job's a really good man. He's such a good man that even God himself says, I can't find anything wrong with Job. He's good. And then all this bad stuff starts happening to Job. His family all dies in a cyclone, I believe it is. All of his crops get wiped out. He gets boils all over his body. Actually, one member of his family has left, his wife, and her response to Job and his suffering is, Job, you should curse your God and die. And then he has some friends. And basically the response of his friends is kind of that karmic idea. You've done something really bad, Job, and if you confess what you've done, maybe God will let up on you. And Job's going, I know I haven't done anything bad. I'm sure I haven't. And in the story, it comes to a point where Job understandably does lose his patience. And he basically starts shaking his fist at God and saying, I'd like for you to come to court and make a case for why this is happening to me. Saying that to God. Well, as can happen in sacred text, God says, okay. And so God comes to Job and on his witness stand delivers this, basically this monologue to Job. And you can read it in the last several chapters of the book of Job. But the monologue goes something like this. Job, do you understand where the hail comes from and the snow comes from? No. Do you know all the animals that live on that mountain over there? No. Do you know who feeds all those animals? No, I don't know. Do you know all the creatures that live below the surface of the sea? No. Do you know how they give birth to their young? No. And God goes through all these things in the world that Job doesn't understand. And God's basic response is, this is another one of those things. There's a lot that you don't understand in the world, and you accept that. So why not accept this as well as something else that you don't fully understand? And so Job finds that place of acceptance, and of course eventually gets everything back, and it's all good. Now, for those of you who are familiar with that story, you know that there's another storyline, right? That there's this other storyline that at the beginning of the book, the reason we know that God thought that Job was perfect was that God and a bunch of heavenly beings, a bunch of spiritual beings were carrying on a conversation, and they were talking about humans. And God was pointing to Job and saying, hey, look at Job. He's a really good guy. I can't even find anything wrong with Job. And one of these spiritual beings says, well, he's just good because you're good to him. And God says, no, he'd be good no matter what. And this being says, well, let me prove you wrong. And so God says, okay, you can do whatever you want to Job, just don't kill him. And so all this stuff starts happening as a result of, at least according to the story, what this spiritual being brings into Job's life. And of course, Job stays faithful through that. But the point is, when God did come to the witness stand to Job, he did not say, okay, this is happening to you because one day a bunch of the spiritual beings and I were talking. And one of them dared me that you weren't that faithful if things went bad. And so I told him he could do whatever he wanted to you. God doesn't tell Job that. As far as we know from the story of Job, Job never knew that part of the story. All he knew was that bad stuff happened, and God said, it's another mystery of life. Accept the mystery. Accept whatever comes into your life as coming from me and having purpose, even if you can't see the purpose. So even the monotheistic worldview kind of gives it that mystery touch, that we don't know why bad things happen, but it's about our response to those bad things happening. Well, we're going to move from these more philosophical religious questions to just talking about defining religion, and that's what we'll do in our next session.